My daughter has always had a gift for choosing the wrong path. My mother's voice doesn't need volume to cut. It never has. In the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York on a Thursday evening in February, with 230 donors, board members, and civic figures arranged across circular tables beneath chandeliers that cost more than my first car, her words moved through the room with the quiet precision of something she had spent months sharpening. She wasn't finished. Medicine. She said it the way certain people say a waste. The same shape of syllables, the same controlled regret. We offered her everything. A firm with 37 years of reputation, clients who trusted the Ashdown name across 3 provinces, and she decided she'd rather spend her life in a hospital basement, cutting people open. She turned to the man standing beside her at the head table, Brigadier General Hugh Whitmore, retired, Order of Canada recipient, this evening's keynote speaker, and the SickKids Foundation's largest single individual donor in the gala's 4-decade history. $300,000, announced 6 weeks prior on the front page of the Globe and Mail. My mother had positioned herself beside him within 8 minutes of his arrival, and I had watched her do it from across the room with the same professional attention I give a patient chart. Because I have been reading my mother's tactical moves since I was old enough to understand that warmth can be a form of architecture. She touched his arm, 2 fingers briefly, the gesture of a woman who has spent 50 years learning how to stand near important men. This, she said, her voice lifting just enough to carry to the outer tables, is what genuine service to this country looks like. My uncle, her brother, 3rd glass of Merlot by my count, red tie already loosened at the collar, nodded from the table behind her. My cousin, who had quietly separated himself from the family firm's junior partnership 18 months earlier after a compliance incident that nobody in the family discusses out loud, sat at the head table in a chair of honor. He sat there because he carried the Ashdown name and the correct chromosome, because my mother had placed him there the way a director positions a prop, while the woman wearing the SickKids Foundation guest badge stood on the open floor of the ballroom absorbing a dismissal that her mother had been rehearsing long before tonight. This was not an outburst. My mother doesn't do outbursts. Outbursts are imprecise, and imprecision is the one quality she has never tolerated in any room she controls. This was a performance she had been building for an audience she had spent a decade cultivating. Tonight's venue, tonight's guest, tonight's phrasing, all of it had been selected. But before I tell you what happened, when General Whitmore turned and looked at my name tag, I need to go back. Because what he did in the next 4 minutes dismantled 30 years of my mother's carefully constructed story in front of every person she had spent those 30 years telling it to. And I need you to understand how we arrived at that room. I was 9 years old, the first time I understood what my mother actually thought of me. She hadn't intended to make it explicit. She rarely did. Explicit was traceable. My mother operated through implication, through calibrated withholding, through the pause she took before answering a question about me that communicated more than the answer ever would. I had left my schoolbooks on the dining room table. She came in, moved them to the floor beside the door without comment, sat down for dinner, and said to no one in particular, "I suppose we can't expect much." 3 words. Not directed at me, not requiring a response. Just released into the room like something she'd tested the weight of first. I picked the books up off the floor and went upstairs. My father found me there 20 minutes later. He was tall and going gray at the temples, and he had the careful hands of a man who had spent years doing precise work, first as a medical corpsman with the Canadian Army, then 31 years as a family physician in Barrie. He sat on the edge of my bed. Outside the window, the maple in the front yard had dropped most of its October leaves, and the street smelled like wet earth and cold pavement. He didn't speak right away. The silence he offered was different from my mother's silences. Hers were always occupied, always in the process of calculating something. His were simply present. Then he said, "Do you know what makes a good doctor, Gwen?" I shook my head. The ability to keep moving when the whole room is telling you to stop. He pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand, a line from Dr. Norman Bethune, the Canadian surgeon who had revolutionized field medicine in conflict zones decades before my father was born, who had built a mobile blood transfusion service at the front lines because people were dying and he was the one standing there. Below the Bethune quote, in my father's own careful block handwriting, he had added, "You are going to disturb a great many comfortable people, kiddo. Don't let them convince you that's the problem." I kept that piece of paper in the back pocket of every pair of scrubs I owned for the next 27 years. The year I was 16, I came home to find my mother on the phone in the kitchen. I stood in the hallway where she couldn't see me. I heard her say, "Of course she has ideas, they all do at this age. She'll come to her senses." A pause. Then her voice dropped half a register, the way it does when she says something she considers to be simply factual, A son would have understood the responsibility. Girls get distracted by the wrong things. She didn't know I was standing in the hallway. That was precisely the point. She didn't edit herself for the hallway, which meant the hallway was where the truth lived. I submitted my application to the University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine that October without telling her. She found out the morning the acceptance letter arrived. She had always opened the mail first. I had stopped challenging this years earlier because challenging things in that house had a price I was still learning how to budget for. By the time I came downstairs, she was standing at the kitchen counter with the open letter in both hands. She read it, put it down, picked it up again. Then she tore it in half, then into quarters, then kept tearing until pieces of white paper covered the granite countertop and the kitchen floor like fragments of something she had decided no longer existed. She walked out without saying a word. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't devastated, but because crying in front of her had always felt like handing over something she would find a use for. That night, I heard my father in the study below my room, the printer running. Then silence, then the back door. He came home after midnight, and when I came downstairs in the morning, there was nothing left on the kitchen floor. On the front hall table sat an envelope addressed to the University of Toronto Faculty of Medicine. He had found the backup copy of my application that I'd kept in a shoebox under my bed. I had shown it to him weeks earlier, and he had asked no questions and made no promises. He had gone to the Staples on Bayfield Street, used the self-serve printer, reconstructed what could be reconstructed, typed a cover letter on his own letterhead, and mailed it from the post office on Dunlop Street before my mother was awake. He was already using supplemental oxygen some nights for the arrhythmia his cardiologist had been monitoring. He spent what his body had left of that particular night, making sure his daughter's future survived the woman who had tried to destroy it. He sat across from me at the kitchen table the next morning and drank his coffee and looked at me over the rim of the mug with the expression of a man who has simply done what needed doing and finds no drama in it. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. I got into U of T. I got into residency at Toronto General. I trained in trauma surgery at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre, became a fellow, became a staff surgeon, became a trauma team leader on the floor. I worked overnight shifts and 36-hour stretches and long weekend calls through snowstorms when half the residents phoned in sick and the trauma bays ran at double capacity. I worked through the kind of exhaustion that eventually stops feeling like a physical state and starts feeling like a form of attention, like something you've incorporated rather than survived. My mother's letters came back unopened when I sent them. 2, then one more after my first staff appointment. The envelopes returned with the seals unbroken. She hadn't opened them to decide not to answer. She simply hadn't opened them at all, so I stopped. When a communication line consistently returns signal without reception, you stop transmitting. You go quiet, and you build something else instead. My father died on a Tuesday night in November. Aortic dissection, fast. His cardiologist told me afterward that he hadn't suffered, which is the sentence physicians use when they want to give the family something to hold that isn't entirely hollow. I was on overnight shift in the trauma bay when the call came. I finished stabilizing the patient in Bay 3, handed off to my second-year resident, went to the staff locker room, and sat on the wooden bench for 4 minutes with my hands on my knees and my eyes on the floor. Then I went back to the floor because that is what he would have told me to do, and because staying in motion was the only way I would get through the rest of that night without coming apart in a room full of people who needed me to be intact. At the funeral home in Barrie, I wore dress clothes I'd borrowed from a colleague. My mother positioned herself on the opposite side of the room, close enough to be in the family frame when the funeral director arranged things far enough that no photograph would naturally capture us together. My uncle managed the flow of mourners. My cousins stood near the food table. Every person who drifted in my direction was gently redirected by someone standing between us with a handshake and a quiet word until the room had been managed around me the way a room is managed when someone has decided in advance what the record of the day will show. I stood beside my father's casket for 2 hours without moving, hands clasped behind my back. It was the only thing I could still do for him by that point, so I did it completely. If you have ever been made to feel invisible in a room full of people who knew exactly what they were doing, if you have ever stood inside that specific silence and kept your feet, stay with me. Because what happened next is for everyone who has ever waited for the room to simply see what was right in front of it. 3 years after the funeral, I was driving home from a trauma conference in Sudbury when the storm that had been building all afternoon finally closed the visibility on Highway 400 to near zero. The first thing I saw was the OPP cruiser lights, then the shapes in the headlights, transport trucks at angles, passenger vehicles crumpled against the median, a medical supply van on its side across the left lane, 31 vehicles, 4 kilometers of highway north of Barrie. I pulled over, I identified myself to the officer at the perimeter. He looked at me for exactly 1 second, then pointed. What happened over the next 4 hours is difficult to describe to someone who has never worked a trauma scene without a hospital around it. The conditions were what they were. -18, a northwest wind off the fields, no imaging equipment, no anesthesia team, no sterile field worth the name. I worked with what I had because the alternative was watching people die while waiting for conditions that were not coming. 14 critically injured patients, 11 survived. I had been developing a field triage sequencing approach for 6 years, a protocol for managing multiple simultaneous critical injuries that I had been refining on the trauma bay floor at Sunnybrook, that I had been using in the controlled environment of a level 1 trauma center. 3 of those 11 patients, by standard metric analysis, should not have survived. But the sequencing worked in conditions it had never been designed for because it was built on a single principle: address the variable you can control before you address the one you cannot. You don't wait for the ideal. You work with what's in front of you. The case review ran in the Canadian Journal of Surgery 6 months later. Emergency medicine conferences put it on the program. The Canadian Armed Forces Medical Services adapted it for forward surgical teams. The residents who trained under it began calling it the 400 protocol. After the highway, after the conditions, after the night, it had first been measured against odds that don't appear in controlled academic settings. In trauma medicine circles, in military field medicine training, in the teaching hospitals where it had become standard curriculum, it was referred to simply as the 400. Brigadier General Hugh Whitmore had been a passenger in the medical supply van. He was unconscious when I reached him, unconscious when I worked, unconscious for the first 3 days of his ICU stay in Barrie. He never saw my face. He had spent the following 3 years looking for the surgeon whose name appeared in the incident documentation. The name attached to the case review, the name his cardiologist had written across the top of the follow-up report with a short note. She is the reason you are reading this. He had searched through professional channels, through foundation connections, through every network available to a man in his position. He had never found me because I don't attend galas as a rule. My department chief had put my name on the Sunnybrook representative list for the evening, the kind of professional obligation that accumulates consequences when ignored. I had come because it was on my calendar and because the alternative was explaining myself to a man whose approval I still needed for my next research funding cycle. General Whitmore did not know that Dr. Gwendolyn Ashdown would be in the room that night. He did not know what she looked like. He only knew, when he turned from my mother's speech and glanced across the ballroom floor, that the name printed on the badge, clipped to the lapel of the woman standing quietly in the center of the room, the woman who had been absorbing a public dismissal with her hands at her sides and her chin level, was a name he had been carrying for 3 years. His face changed the way a vital sign changes, not by degrees, but all at once, the way a reading crosses a threshold and the alarm sounds. He stepped back 1/2 step. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it filled the room the way a command fills a room, not through volume, but through the complete absence of uncertainty. Dr. Ashdown, not a question, a recognition. You're the surgeon who developed the 400 protocol. My mother laughed. The specific laugh she uses when she needs a moment to recalculate. Oh, Hugh, I'm sure she does very good work at the hospital, but we were in the middle of... I apologize for the interruption. He said it without apology, but I need a moment. He turned to face the room. No glance at my mother for permission, no explanation offered. He stood the way men who have given orders in the field stand when the moment requires it. Wait even, completely still, nothing performed. 4 years ago, he said, I was in a multi-vehicle collision on Highway 400 north of Barrie. I was told afterward that by the time emergency services reached me, survival was unlikely by standard triage assessment. The surgeon who treated me on the highway median that night used a protocol she had been developing for years through practice in one of this country's busiest trauma centers. That protocol is now taught in Canadian military field medicine training. It is part of the emergency surgery curriculum at 6 medical schools. It has been credited with improving critical survival rates in mass casualty events by 18% across documented cases. He paused. I have spent 3 years trying to find this woman. He said my name, my full name, into a room that had gone completely silent. I am alive, he said, because of her. The silence that followed had actual weight. Not the polite pause between program items. Something denser. The kind that comes when 200 people receive information simultaneously that contradicts the frame they have been sitting inside, and no one moves until the contradiction has finished settling. My mother gripped the edge of the podium. Her knuckles were pale. The chair of the SickKids Foundation board, a retired cardiologist of 72 who had read the 400 protocol case review in the Canadian Journal of Surgery 2 years prior and had recommended it to 3 colleagues, stood from his table. He didn't speak, he simply stood. The woman beside him, a retired emergency physician who had trained at McMaster and had been incorporating the protocol into her own teaching for over a year, stood. A man from a table near the back, the posture of someone who had served, the particular stillness of it, stood. Then another. Then the wave of it moved through the ballroom the way cold moves through a building when a door has been opened somewhere. Not a single front but 100 individual decisions made one at a time, without consultation or instruction, no applause, no words, just the quiet sound of chairs pushed back and the deliberate act of people rising from their seats. My mother stood at the podium and watched the room decline to perform the scene she had designed. I walked forward, my heels on the marble floor, each step landing clean. I stopped 2 feet from her, close enough that only she could hear what I said next. I understand that you built something real, and that you wanted someone to carry it forward. I'm not asking you to approve of the path I took. My voice was level. But you do not get to use my work as evidence for your argument. Not in this room. Not again. 3 seconds. I held her eyes for 3 full seconds, then I turned and walked back. Not a single person in that room took their seat beside her. She found me in the hotel lobby an hour later. The auction was still running inside, paddles raised, numbers called, particular cheerful machinery of institutional fundraising, continuing without anyone at its center needing to hold it together. She came through the side door in her coat, her composure mostly intact, her hands clasped in front of her. She stood across from me and I let the silence sit between us. In surgery, silence from a patient tells you something. In a lobby, silence from your mother after 30 years of talking tells you something too, if you know what you're reading. She looked at the floor, then at me. Her voice when it came was smaller than I had ever heard it. I didn't know what happened on that highway, she said. What you built, what it became, I was never told. This was not an apology. I know the difference. An apology takes the shape of the harm it's meant to address. What my mother was offering was a reclassification. 30 years of deliberate choices reframed as a failure of information. She hadn't known, therefore she hadn't chosen. The cruelty becomes miscalculation. The 30 years become a misunderstanding rather than a pattern. A clerical error, not a crime of the heart. I looked at her for a long time. What I built, I said, I built because of what you spent 30 years telling me I couldn't do. That is the truth of it. I'm not asking you to carry that, but I'm not going to pretend it's something else. I picked up my coat. Drive home carefully. If the 400 is bad tonight, take Highway 11. There's usually less ice on the east side of the county. I walked out through the hotel's main doors into the February cold. The city smelled like exhaust and snow and the particular damp of a Toronto February that never quite commits to being winter. I drove to Barrie the next morning. The cemetery is east of town, off a side road that runs between bare cornfields and a stand of old maples. I went early, before the frost had lifted. The ground was hard underfoot. The air smelled like iron and cold pine sap and the specific stillness of an Ontario morning that hasn't yet decided what it's going to be. My father's stone is simple. His name, his years, and the line I had asked the engraver to add beneath. He knew the value of the work that nobody sees. 8 words. He would have found 9 excessive. I crouched and pressed my bare palm flat against the stone. The cold came through immediately, the deep cold of marble in February, and I let it. I made it, I said. There was no one within earshot. I said it because it was the only sentence that carried the full weight of the previous 24 hours without breaking under that weight. The room stood up, Dad, all of them, without being asked. I reached into the inside pocket of my coat and took out the piece of paper, the Bethune quote in his careful block handwriting, the note in his own words beneath it. 27 years in the pocket of scrubs. The fold lines were pale as old scar tissue now, the paper worn soft, the ink still holding. I had carried it through residency and fellowship and overnight shifts and the long drives north on Highway 400 and the particular darkness of a hospital at 3 a.m. when you sit with the weight of everything you are responsible for, and you breathe and you keep going, because keeping going is the only thing. I set it against the base of the headstone, leaned it against the cold stone, the way you lean a door closed when you want the draft to stop but don't need the latch to catch. I don't need to carry this anymore. You gave me the first and most important thing anyone has ever given me, the belief that the work was worth doing even when no one was watching, especially then. I stood, squared my shoulders, raised my right hand to my brow and held a salute, not because regulation required it, not because a single soul was watching, but because it was the only gesture in my entire vocabulary that could carry both grief and gratitude in the same motion without diminishing either one. 5 seconds. Then I dropped my hand, turned on my heel, and walked back to my car without looking back. The piece of paper my father had written on 36 years ago stayed against cold marble in a Barrie cemetery. For the first time since I was 9 years old, it was not in my pocket. The absence didn't feel like loss. It felt like something finished. The last item on a list that had taken 3 decades to complete, checked off in the early morning quiet of a February field in Ontario, with no audience and no ceremony and no one to confirm it had happened. I drove south on the 400 through a flat white morning, the fields running bare and wide on either side, the sky the pale gray of a province that knows how to endure. In 3 hours, I would be back in Toronto. I would pull on scrubs. I would walk into Sunnybrook and take the handoff from the overnight team and stand in the trauma bay in the particular quiet of a hospital before the day begins. The smell of antiseptic and recycled heat, the hum of equipment, the sound of a building holding its breath before the first call comes in. A room where the work is its own answer. A room where nobody asks whose family you came from. Some things you don't inherit. You build them in the dark, without an audience, in conditions nobody designed you for, because the person in front of you needs you to, and because there is no version of yourself that walks away from that. It turns out that was always enough. It turns out it always will be.